right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here, both in the room and online. We just appreciate you being a part of our seminar series. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon. These seminar events are hybrid events, so there are more people online than there are in the room. So to help facilitate that, folks online, if you have any questions, either technical around being able to hear us or see something, or if you have questions for our speaker, please put those into the chat box. And we have a volunteer, Roseanne, thanks Roseanne, that will read those questions out and we'll get those addressed. For folks that are in the room, we'll be getting to questions for our speaker today at the end of today's talk, but you will need a microphone. So if you can just raise your hand when you have those questions when we open the question session, or if you so choose, if you're in the back of the room, you can use the mic that's there on the stand so that folks online can hear the questions, and we'll get started with that way. So also for folks that are new to us, there's a sign-up sheet outside. The only reason I use that is I can justify buying us cookies. So if you can sign up for that, that helps us justify getting those cookies, and you can eat those cookies when you get out of here today. Couple of quick announcements. We will not have a seminar next week. It is OSU spring break, so there is no seminar next week, but come back the first week of April and we will start our seminar series again for the spring term. I also wanted to promote that tonight, it's actually kind of a double header today. Tonight we have a Science on Tap. So Science on Taps are our public events that talk about research that's happening here at Hatfield, and they're a little bit more public focused, but everyone is welcome. So that starts officially at 6, but we're doing a social hour before that from 5 to 6, and the cafe will be serving drinks and providing food. So you're welcome to stick around for that. And so just letting you know that that is tonight. And our speaker is Josh Stewart, and he's going to be talking about human interaction with whales and the impact on endangered whale species. So that'll be a really interesting talk. I also wanted to just promote Marine Science Day. If you haven't heard about that, that is our public open house where we have about 40 exhibitors that will be doing a kind of like a science fair for the public. And so if you are interested in attending, that is April 8th from 10 to 4. So come on by. We haven't been on site and in person in a couple of years, so this is an exciting event. If you're one of ours and you have done it before and you would like to volunteer, we're always looking for volunteers. So you can reach out to me after and I can get you set up with volunteering for that event. But why you're all here is to hear about our speaker today. And actually our speaker was connected to Tommy with ODF&W, who is emeritus now, even though I make fun of him because he's not. He works just as hard as he ever did. And so I'm going to hand this off to him and he's going to introduce today's speaker, Tommy Swearingen.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Our speaker today is Mark Needham. And Mark is a professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. And he's also director of the Natural Resource Tourism and Recreation Lab, or Nature Lab. He's, in addition, the director of the graduate programs within the department. He is also a former editor of the Human Dimensions of Wildlife Journal. He went to University of Victoria for his undergraduate and his master's, and then he got his PhD at Colorado State. And Mark has specialized in understanding human experiences and behavior in the context of natural resources and how that may relate to management and the advancement of science. And he has published, let's see, over 80 journal articles, authored 1 book and 12 chapters. And I checked his Google Scholar profile. He currently has 3,915 citations. So he's quite an accomplished academic. In addition, Mark is a very accomplished award-winning wildlife photographer. So when he isn't working on research in social psychology, his junketing around the world, usually every summer, taking pictures, you name it, he's been there. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Mark.
I got this one. Great. Thanks, Tommy. Everyone can hear me okay? Awesome. All right. So delighted to be here. This is, I think, at last count, my 6th time I've presented here, but this is the first time in this building. This is very different from the little room that we had in the library in the old Hatfield and stuff. So I'm delighted to be here and see some familiar faces as well. So the topic of my talk today is the Oregon Marine Reserves, and in particular, looking at changes over time, particularly about the last decade or so. We've been involved in about a decade's worth of research. I'd like to acknowledge my co-participants on this research and investigators, Dr. Lori Cramer, who's in the Department of Sociology at Oregon State, Kristen McAlpine, who's a master's student working with me, who will be defending her thesis next month, so that's getting close, and also Tommy, who I've worked with very closely on this research. Before that, it was Melissa with ODF&W, and so, yeah, it's been a long, really fruitful partnership. Let's use this. All right, so like I said, the topic is marine reserves. So what are marine reserves? And I've got the IUCN definition up there, a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal and other means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature and associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So what they're really about are placing some restrictions, not full restrictions all the time, on human activity with the goal of protecting ecosystems and habitats and species, but also the associated social, economic, and cultural aspects of it. And the names and designations vary dramatically. So if you look around the world, there are all sorts of names. Some are marine reserves, some are marine protected areas, some are marine parks, some are marine life conservation districts, and on and on and on. And there are some slight differences between each of these in terms of the level of protections and size and stuff like that. I'm going to use marine reserves today because that's what Oregon has, and we're talking about Oregon's marine reserves. At last count, there's just under 20,000 of these around the world, representing about 8% of the world's oceans. In context, that's increased dramatically over the last decade. A decade ago, it was less than 4%. So it's doubled in the last decade. There's been a real push around the world to increase both the number and size of marine protected areas or marine reserves. In Oregon, the initial goal was to create a system of fewer than 10 that were large enough for conservation benefits for species and such, but small enough to avoid major detrimental impacts to the economy and society. That's wording that came out from the state legislature at the time. And Senate Bill 1510 was in 2012, and that established the first 5 marine reserves in Oregon, and that's what we still have today. And so if you're not aware of where these are, I'll just show a little map here. The one that's furthest north is Cape Falcon, not far from Cannon Beach, that area. And then Cascade Head, not far from Lincoln City. Otter Rock, which is just north of where we're at today. And then Cape Perpetua, a little south of us toward Yachats. And then Redfish Rocks, which is the furthest south near Port Orford. So those are the 5. And they all slightly differ from each other, but one thing you'll notice from the map is that they're not all entirely marine reserves. In Oregon, we actually have marine protected areas as well as marine reserves, and they're adjacent to each other. And they differ a little bit from one place to the next. The marine protected areas, in many cases, have slightly less restrictive restrictions compared to the marine reserves. But that's sort of the main difference between them. All right, so what's the objectives of our research? Our research started way back in 2010 associated with the marine reserves. There was a lot of discussion for a couple of years, and then we launched our first study just after the marine reserves were established. And really with the goal of measuring public thoughts about these places, about these reserves. What does the public think? What do they know? What do they like? What do they dislike? They think it's a good idea? Do they think it's a stupid idea? That's really what we were going after. So the goal was to collect social data, or what's also known as human dimensions data, from large and representative samples of the public. There were, in the early studies done around between 2010 and 2012, it was often with small groups of people, invested stakeholders, not what does the public writ large feel about these areas. So we were really interested in getting much larger, more representative samples. Specifically, we were interested in looking at things like their awareness and knowledge. What do they know about these places? What are their attitudes and beliefs? How would they vote if this came up on a ballot initiative? What activities do they think should be allowed or not allowed? Would they change their behavior at all? Would they visit? Would they visit more often, less often? And also trust in those responsible for managing these areas. And what I'm really going to talk a lot about today is measuring any potential change over time. And this is the first time we've been able to do this. And has public opinion shifted at all since these reserves were established? And that's actually quite rare in my field of study. Often we do cross-sectional research. What that means is studies done at one point in time, often in one place, but we actually have data across 10 years, across multiple places around Oregon, which actually kind of adds more sort of validity to what we're trying to do. Okay, so these marine reserves, at the time they were established, little controversy around this. There were concerns. There was some vocal opposition and also some vocal support. But like I said, we didn't really have any good data to say, okay, do these opinions represent everyone, or are they just a small group of folks? That's really why we wanted to get more information. So we've collected a lot of data over the last 10 years. And the first study we did was of coastal residents up and down the coast. We did a mail survey to a random sample of residents, households up and down the coast. That was achieved through postal records. And this was done pretty much immediately after implementation of the marine reserves. We did 3 mailings of this because often when you send out a mail survey, you can't just send it once. You have to kind of annoy people multiple times for them to actually send the completed survey back to you. And then we've also sampled non-coastal residents, not everywhere in the state. That would be ideal, but funding has limited us. But what we tended to focus on was the largest population belt or cluster in Oregon. So the I-5 corridor from Portland down to Ashland between the 2 mountain ranges, where a big hunk of people live. And this was predominantly a mail survey. We did include an internet option, so if people wanted to fill it out online, they could. And this was done in early 2016. Ideally, we would have done both of these at the same time, but we had to split it up across multiple bienniums. So what were our sample sizes? Well, for coastal residents, it was almost 600. To put this into some sort of logic and proportion, most representative samples of people across the entire country in the US, they're around 1,000. That's typically what the sample size is. And sort of the magic number in our field to be representative of a population of 100,000 people, we need 383 completed surveys. Any guesses on how many we need to be able to say something about 1 billion people? So going from 100,000 to 1 billion, if 100,000 is 383, what do you think we need for 1 billion? Any guesses? 500? Anyone else? No, you can't answer this, Tommy, because you know the answer. Any other guesses? Just blurt it out. 3 million? All right. 3 million and 500, very different. Any other guesses? All right. The answer is 384. You need one more. All right. So to go from 100,000 to 1 billion, you need one more survey. It's like a blood test. You know, when you go into the doctor and they say, all right, we're gonna do a blood test, they don't drain all the blood out of you to find out what's going on. They take a sample. And if the more information they want, they'll take a little bit more, but it's kind of like a log curve, the law of diminishing returns. So we were in good shape here. We're well over that number. And for the coastal sample, we split it between 2 different groups. The community is a place, which those are the people who live within a 10-mile radius of the reserve. So keep that in the back of your head. And then everyone else who lived along the rest of the coast, not within the radiuses of those reserves. Our response rate was just under 30%. That's actually good in today's numbers. It's really difficult getting people to fill out surveys. For the non-coastal residents, 530, response rate a little bit lower. Not surprising, they're a little bit more physically removed from where these reserves are located. So because of these response rates, we needed to do what's called a non-response bias check. So for the coastal residents, the 73% who didn't respond and didn't send us back a survey, are they any different from those who did? And for the non-coastal, the 80% who didn't, are they any different from the 20% who did? So what we do is we actually telephone a pretty big group of those, and we ask them a battery of the questions from the questionnaire, and then we compare answers. And in both cases, there were no substantive differences at all. However, we did have to do some data weighting by census, by demographics, population proportions, and stuff like that, just to make sure that our data from these samples is truly representative of the entire population in these areas we're interested in. So this is what I'm calling the baseline, or you'll see old. I'll use that word, but that's sort of our older data from 10-ish years ago. More recently, we repeated the entire study, both coastal and non-coastal, but not the same people, different households, deliberately targeting different people, all right? And this was done back right in the middle of COVID, basically, and between early and mid 2021. These are not the same people. Sample sizes you can see here, 473 from the coast, 351 from non-coast. And again, similar proportions in terms of breakdown between the communities of place folks living nearest the reserves and those along the rest of the coast. And we did exactly the same thing in terms of weighting the data to make sure that we did it exactly the same way as we did in the earlier data, so we have direct comparisons. Now, what's important here is this is known as a between group analysis because these are different people. So between people, all right, over time. And that's what longitudinal means, all right? And so our total sample size across these studies was close to 2,000 when you add it all up. And the comparison I'm going to make today is the baseline, so the stuff from 10 years ago to now, which is the comparative. We did also do what's known as panel sampling, where we went back to those same people that completed a questionnaire 10 years ago and asked them some of the same questions. Now, people move, people shift, people die, those kind of things happen, so you end up getting smaller samples in doing this. And to make sure we matched the same people, we had a question in the questionnaire saying, do you remember receiving a questionnaire and answering it like 10 years ago? And it kind of looked like this. And then we also, so anyone who said yes to that, obviously, and then we also looked carefully at demographics. Every one of the demographic questions needed to match up perfectly for us to include them in a panel sample. So sample sizes here are quite a bit smaller, 99 on the coast, 115 non-coast, higher response rate because these are people who filled it out before. So this is known as a within group analysis where it's exactly the same people. That's what's called a panel sample over time. So 214. I'm not going to discuss the results of this today because if I was, you'd think I was crazy because it would sound really repetitive. The results from this are almost identical, pretty much identical to the longitudinal study. So I'm going to present the big sample size, not the small sample size today, just in the interest of time. Okay, so let's dig into some of the results. What do people think? Well, before we get to the marine reserves, we had a bunch of questions just about marine areas in general and the environment in general. And one question was people's opinions basically of protection versus use of marine areas in general, not marine reserves. And so we asked just a simple question: should we fully protect marine areas with no human utilization? Should we mostly protect with a little human use? Should we mostly use with a little human, or should we just forget about protection and just use these areas? And you can see the two columns there, baseline, that's the older data, and the comparative is the newer data. What happened is this protection went up from 70% total up to 81%, and that was a statistically significant increase of 11 points. All right, and you can see those 6% has moved up in terms of fully protecting marine areas. Now, the highest protection was among the non-coastal residents, those living sort of Portland to Ashland, between the two mountain ranges. The lowest was among those who living along the rest of the coast. Now, this is something that's important to kind of stick in your brain because you're going to see a pattern emerge through a lot of these results, where those who live along the rest of the coast, in other words, they're not within the 10-mile radius of these marine reserves, they're quite a bit different than those who live close to the marine reserves and those along the I-5 corridor. Those two groups are actually quite similar in their responses. And you're going to see this pattern emerge quite a bit. And like I said, there was an increase over time in protection that you can see there, and that was consistent across all locations, coast, communities of place, and the I-5 corridor. So getting to the marine reserves, We wanted to find out if people have been these places before. So we actually had pretty detailed maps in the questionnaires embedded in there, and we asked people a bunch of questions associated with that. One of which was, have you ever visited one of these places before? 10 years ago, it was about 64%, 2/3. It didn't change much over the last decade or so. 1%, not a significant increase. Not surprisingly, the highest visitation is the people who live closest to these areas and the communities of place. The lowest was the people furthest away among the non-coastal areas, but no change over time in this at all, despite the reserves have been established for 10 years or so, and there's no real increase in visitation. How about impacts on future visitation? We asked people, now that these sites are marine reserves, what do you want to do? Would you visit the same amount? Which, if you've never visited before, that would be, well, I'm never going to go. Are you going to visit more often, or are you going to visit less often? And there was a little bit of an uptick, 4%, in terms of people saying they'd visit more often. Less often was the same, but not a significant difference over time. So in terms of visitation, there's really no main signal here over time. Was slightly higher over time across all the locations, but again, not big, minimal difference, and minimal impacts, and very little differences across the different locations. All right, now let's get into knowledge. There's two different types of knowledge mainly in our field. One is self-assessed and the other is factual. Self-assessed is what people think they know, how smart people think they are. Factual knowledge is how smart they really are, because it tests facts. So we had a bunch of questions about self-assessed knowledge. I feel personally familiar with these reserves. I understand the purpose. I feel informed. I feel knowledgeable, yada, yada, yada. And the only two questions that had the majority saying, yeah, was I feel personally familiar with these reserves and I understand their purpose. So those were the only two that had greater than the majority. Everything else was lower than that. The lowest was I feel like I understand rules and regulations of the reserves, stuff like that. If you look at the comparison over time, there's not really big differences here. In fact, there's only 3 questions, the red ones that have the little red box around it, where there was a significant difference over time. Understanding the purpose, understanding the role of science, and understanding where these reserves are located. Those all saw a significant increase, but it's not huge. It's only 5-6% or so. In terms of comparisons across the locations, the lowest knowledge was among the the non-coastal folks. So the furthest away feel less knowledgeable. That's not entirely surprising, because the more physically removed you are, the less you might know about it. Knowledge slightly increased in the communities of place. This is self-assessed knowledge. So closest to the reserves and also the I-5 corridor non-coastal folks, but it actually dropped a little bit among the rest of the coast, which is interesting. So those people felt a little less knowledgeable now than they did 10 years ago. But let's get at factual knowledge. And this is where ODF&W hates me, sorry. When it comes to factual knowledge about the marine reserves, the public is pretty stupid. Let's just say it what it is. Very, very low knowledge. We had a battery of questions, 11 questions that were true-false type questions. And we also had another one in there about agency responsible. If you look in the yellow at the bottom, the average grade in the early studies was 42%. That's a failing grade in university and school these days. 10 years later, it had increased a whopping 2%. So not a big difference in factual knowledge over time at all. And if you look at these questions, there's really no big differences over time, except one of them. What agency is currently responsible for marine reserves in Oregon? That saw a significant increase. So that's where ODF&W now is happy with me. All right. When we get to the questions, I might speculate as to why this is the case. I think in reality, the number now is actually a little lower than 53%. But I'll get to why I think that's the case in the questions. Lowest knowledge, not surprisingly, was the non-coastal folks. Again, the more separated you are, the less knowledgeable. And it did increase a little bit, but not significantly along the coast in terms of the communities of place closest to the reserves, and also the I-5 corridor area, but it declined slightly along the rest of the coast. But not big shifts in knowledge here. It's pretty low. Part of this are these 2 questions. One question we asked was, is it easy to access and find information about marine reserves in Oregon? And 10 years ago, only 18% agreed with that statement, and that's only gone up 4% since. Only 22% say, yeah, it's easy for me to find information about the marine reserves. So that's not a significant increase over time. And then we also asked, managers have done a good job communicating with the public about marine reserves. To what extent do you agree or disagree? And that's gone up 1% from a very low 11 to 12%, not significant over time. So this might explain some of these results in terms of low knowledge. The highest agreement was in the communities of place, which isn't entirely surprising. The people living closest to those reserves tend to be more interested and informed about these areas. All right, we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about some beliefs. What do people think should be allowed in these places? Overwhelmingly, the number one was scientific research should be allowed. That's a big reason why these were established. Not the only reason, but a big reason. And the majority also said non-extractive recreation, so not fishing, essentially, should be allowed. Recreational and commercial fishing, you can see, are pretty low. Right? In terms of change over time, not much, other than the first one went up significantly, but it's only 4%. There is more agreement for recreational and commercial fishing being allowed for those residents living along the rest of the coast, not those living closest to the reserves, but along the rest of the coast. They thought fishing should be allowed a little bit more. Again, it's still under 50%, just higher than the other places, but that's actually declined over time a little bit. Who do people think these reserves benefit? By far and away, number one, again, is the science and research side of things. Government agencies, you can see that's above the 50% sort of majority. People who live along the Oregon coast actually went up quite a bit, from 49% up to 63% over time. And then down the bottom is the fishing side of things not benefiting. There was some significant change over time. You can see actually all of the percentages, I think, on the far right-hand side are slightly higher than those for the baseline. And 4 of those were statistically significant where we saw an increase in terms of, yeah, we think people would benefit from this. And it's mostly around the idea of where people live and local businesses, stuff like that. The local businesses and for people who live along the coast, the people from the rest of the coast, in other words, not in those close to the marine reserves, they actually thought that those two groups benefited quite a bit less than and compared to the answers for those living in other areas. But these increases did have increased over time across all locations, so more benefits. How about who's harmed? Kind of the mirror opposite of that previous slide. So you can see here the fishing commercially and recreationally is the highest in terms of harm, and then everything after that is under the majority. But far less change over time here. Pretty similar. There's a few here that were statistically significant, local businesses, people who live along the coast and not along the coast, and government agencies, all those numbers dropped significantly in terms of harm. So maybe we've seen these reserves now for a decade, and maybe it's not as bad as we thought. Maybe these groups aren't being harmed as much as we initially thought. And again, same kind of issues in terms of the people along the rest of the coast are perceiving a little bit more harm to local businesses. And these decreases were pretty similar across all the different locations. Okay, here's the most important slide today. We asked people basically a ballot initiative question. If this went to a ballot initiative, what would you do? So if you were given an opportunity to vote for or against having marine reserves in Oregon, how would you vote? And back in our early studies, it was 79% voting in favor, 21% against. Pretty strong support. I mean, that's very different than most elections we have these days, which are right around 50% in different things. This is pretty overwhelming. And it went up over the last 10 years, up to 86% in favor. And that was a statistically significant increase over time. The people are receiving more benefits. They're liking this idea a little bit more. They're still dumb when it comes to the topic. They don't know anything, but they like the idea. All right. We also asked, okay, now that you've told us how you would vote, how certain are you would you vote this way? And we saw an increase from 88% to 92% in the in terms of people saying, yeah, I'm moderately or extremely certain this is the way I would vote. So not only is it going up in terms of voting in favor, but also it's solidifying a little bit more over time. Again, the rest of the coast folks, those living along the coast, not closest to the reserves, less likely to vote in favor. All right, like I said, these are a bit of a different group compared to the other two samples. Not huge. It's about a 10% difference, 10 to 15, depending on the data set. So it's not like only 20% of them would vote in favor. It's not that. There's still majority in support, but a little less so than the other places. And this increase over time is consistent everywhere that we studied. We also asked attitudes in general. And we did this through a series of what are called semantic differential scales, which are basically pairs of opposing words like, dislike, good, bad, harmful, beneficial, that kind of stuff, and then a scale of numbers in between. And what I've done is I've put the positive ones in here. So marine reserves in Oregon are beneficial, they're positive, I like the idea, they're all good. And you can see the numbers here are all over 70%. So that's consistent with the voting question that I had mentioned. But what you also can see here is the numbers went up. All of them is a statistically significant increase in favorable attitudes toward these reserves over time. All right, and that was consistent across all the locations that we studied. Again, slightly less positive for those living along the rest of the coast compared to those closest to the marine reserves. But so these kind of numbers show there's over the last decade or so, there's been about a 10% shift toward the more positive. So kind of like a % a year type thing. And we asked a bunch of questions about different attitudes. I'm not going to go into all the detail and read all of these over, and your eyes might gloss over looking at all this. It's not important to read everything. But these are some potential advantages of marine reserves that are being cited in literature. And to what extent do people agree this would be the case here in Oregon? The number one was allow scientists to monitor areas and then improve our understanding. And then way down at the bottom, things like improving the economy and increasing tourism. But if you look at these numbers, all of them increase over time. And all of them were statistically significant increases over time, some bigger than others. But essentially what this is saying is that people are seeing more advantages of these reserves now than they did a decade or so ago. Again, those living along the rest of the coast, their percentages were a little bit lower than the others. But this increase over time was consistent everywhere we surveyed. How about disadvantages? Things like marine reserves can cause fishing to go down. All right, so reductions in commercial and recreational fishing. You can see here between half and 2/3 kind of agreed. Yeah, that's a potential disadvantage. In terms of change over time, there wasn't as much here. There were a few, I think 4 here where we saw changes. And in terms of change, these all decrease. So people are thinking that these disadvantages aren't as big a deal now as they were 10 years ago. In this case, those living along the rest of the coast had more agreement with these, right? Which is sort of the opposite of what we saw with the advantages. Okay, and just a couple more result slides, and then I'll get into what all this stuff means. Trust in management. We had a whole battery of questions. One area of focus of my research over the years is trust in agencies. And it's interesting because we always hear on the media, oh, the public hates the government, they don't trust the government and stuff like that. But actually, when you start digging into doing research into this, that's not always the case. Some places it is. But in Oregon, we tend to see majority trust for government agencies in all the studies that we do. And so we had a whole battery of different questions about truthful information and timely information and making good management decisions and all this kind of stuff. And you can see during the baseline 10 years ago or so, it was between sort of 50% and 2/3 agreed with these statements. Now it's kind of between 2/3 and 3/4. All of these percentages have gone up over time. So what this is showing us is that trust in the agency to manage these reserves is increasing over time. All right, but only 2 of these were statistically significant. And it's the bottom 2. We trust ODF&W to make good decisions regarding management and to use public input to inform management of marine reserves. And this was not a shock to me. We've bombarded people with surveys over the years. And so it's not a surprise to me that people are saying, oh, you guys keep doing this research and asking our opinions over and over and over again. Well, they must be using this for something. It must be to inform management decisions. So sure, we trust them. So that doesn't entirely surprise me. Lowest trust was, again, that rest of the coast group. They weren't super low. They were about 5 to 10% lower than the other locations, but they had the lowest trust. And this increase in trust over time, although it's a slight increase and only significant for a couple items, was consistent across all the locations. So everywhere we surveyed, trust is going up. And the last result slide is we asked people thinking about these marine reserves, what values do you assign to these areas? What do these things mean to you? How important are these different things to you when you think about marine reserves? And the top 5, I'm not going to read them all out, but they all have to do with conservation, species, the environment. All right. So protect marine species, endangered species, water quality. The last one's about scientific discovery and stuff. And people could select more than one item, so that's why the percentages are high. I decided not to fill the whole slide here with numbers because there were 23 different items. The bottom 5 all had to do with human stuff. So like recreation and tourism and symbols of heritage and culture. No one really cared too much about those. Over time, those top ones increased in importance. The bottom ones decreased in importance. So there's more of a focus on kind of the conservation side of it. Okay. There's a lot of numbers and a lot of results. Who cares? Let's talk about some of the implications of this. First series of results I presented is quite a few people had visited and been to these places, but when it came to their knowledge, particularly factual knowledge, they weren't too smart about these places. They didn't know much, all right? And they also thought it was hard to find information and that management hasn't really done a good job of educating us about these reserves. And we didn't really see any change in that over the last 10 years. Part of that is ODF&W's sort of information and communications person. That position's been vacant for a huge amount of that time, all right? It hasn't been as big a priority for the agency compared to some other things. And so I'm not entirely surprised that we didn't see much improvement there. So, but we do need to do more in terms of informing and educating citizens about these reserves. In particular, the thing people knew the least about was that 5 reserves had already been established. Fewer than 20% knew that. So at the very least, we should be telling people, we've got 5 reserves in Oregon. And kind of this is where they are, and this is what's allowed and not allowed, that kind of stuff. And really, we should be targeting the whole citizenry with this information, particularly the non-coastal populations, because their knowledge was even lower than those living closest. Most people thought scientific research and non-extractive recreation should be allowed. Most people thought fishing should not be allowed. And we didn't really see too much change over time in those. But what's interesting and important here is fishing is actually allowed in some of these areas, particularly some of those adjacent protected areas, not in the marine reserves, but in some of those adjacent protected areas, some very sort of restricted recreational fishing is allowed. So one thing we definitely need to be doing is trying to help people avoid some of the confusion between what's a reserve, what's a protected area, what are the differences between these two, what's allowed in these two, and why do we allow certain things in one area and not in another. But that can be really difficult because marine settings are a little different than territorial settings. So how many of you have been to a national park or a state park? Quite a few people, all right? Well, often when you drive in or walk in or bike into these areas, often there's a booth there that you might have to pay an entrance fee. It's a big sign that says you are now entering, Crater Lake National Park. You kind of know when you're getting into a protected area, right? That's not the case with marine reserves in many cases. So here's redfish rocks before the marine reserves. Here's redfish rocks after the marine reserves. It's the same picture, all right? So people often, they don't even know they're in a reserve. They don't know what the differences between reserve and protected area are. It's quite difficult. It's much more difficult for managers to articulate these differences when we don't have sort of geographical landmarks to kind of focus on. Groups the majority thought would benefit: scientists, agencies, people living along the coast. Those were all the sort of majority felt those were the groups that would benefit. Groups that would be harmed were those people fishing commercially or recreation. Now, over time, all of those benefits actually increased over time, and particularly benefits to local businesses and people living along the coast. That's where we saw the biggest difference over time. So what we need to do is we need to sort of inform more about some of the potential benefits of these reserves. Some of the things that people thought would harm the most were things to like local businesses and fishing, but there's actually some big benefits of marine reserves for those groups. For example, tourism revenue generated from people wanting to visit these areas or see these areas can have big benefits for local businesses. Marine reserves are mainly established to help species recover and to help the environment, but that can actually have positive benefits in terms of long-term sustainability for fishing outside the reserves. All right. So articulating these benefits is important. There was overwhelming positive attitudes about these reserves across all of the years of data collection, but that actually increased over time. People feel better about the reserves now than they did 10 years ago. They're slightly more likely to visit now than they were 10 years ago. And also the voting question that we had, the large majority, 79% 10 years ago said we would vote in support, and that's gone up now to 86%. That's increasing over time. The most positive attitudes are those people living closest to the marine reserves and in the more distant population, the I-5 corridor. This is actually a little different than we see in other places around the world. There's many studies that show that people people who live closest to the reserves hate them more compared to people who don't live near them. We see kind of the opposite here. People who are closest to these are actually among the most favorable toward them. But that doesn't mean that other groups don't count. They matter just as much, all right? We didn't survey Eastern Oregonian folks. We haven't surveyed non-residents. There's a huge number of people who visit the Oregon coast in the summer who come from other states. We haven't captured that in our research, all right? And those are important constituencies that could still be impacted. So yeah, the people who live closest and the people in the main population belt, the voting public, the biggest sort of voting bloc in the state, do feel the most positive, but they're not the only people who matter. Those who live along the rest of the coast matter, and those who we haven't sampled also matter. Most people agree that the reserves have some advantages, largely around this idea of environmental issues like species recovery and diversity and monitoring for science and just better understanding for marine areas. But also the majority thought that, well, there are some disadvantages of these reserves in terms of impacts on fishing, difficulties with enforcement, costs of enforcement, things like that. And agreement with the advantages is increasing over time. Agreement with the disadvantages is decreasing over time, which is kind of consistent with the voting and the attitude stuff. But there are still huge disadvantages with placing areas under protected area designation, all right? There are costs associated with this. So from a management perspective, it's really important to really be balanced and transparent that, yeah, there are advantages. That's why we set these things up in the first place. But there's also some realistic challenges and costs encountered when you put any place under protection. One good thing is the majority of the public trusts ODF&W in terms of their management and information associated with these reserves, and that's increased slightly over time, not a huge amount, but slightly. So in terms of messaging and so information campaigns and those kind of things, you've got a respective audience, which is good. It's much more difficult if they hate you. My last slide, essentially, is those assigned values. What aspects of these marine areas are important to people, not important, that kind of stuff. And the most important ones were all around the environmental stuff and scientific stuff like protecting habitat and species and water and those kind of things. The least important were associated with us, with people. So things like tourism and recreation, and those things are less important now than they were 10 years ago, and the environmental stuff's more important than it was 10 years ago. This is very useful information to know because that aligns directly with ODF&W's mission associated with these reserves. And actually, if you go back to some of the early language in legislature around the creation of these reserves, there was language like what you see here: conserve marine habitats and biodiversity, serve as scientific reference sites to learn about marine reserves and inform nearshore management. So the values that people are assigning these areas, that the public's assigning to these areas, largely matches why these areas were created in the first place. And if we look at when like new national parks and state parks are created, we often don't see this synergy. We often see quite different, the agencies establishing these protected areas for one reason, but the public is thinking about quite different reasons. We don't see that here. We see quite a bit of synergy. And like I said earlier, most studies, if I was to do kind of full bibliometric analysis of all of our journals that we publish in, if I looked at that over the last 30, 40 years, I would hazard a guess that between 90 and 95% of those studies are single site cross-sectional studies. So at one place at one point in time. What we have here is multiple places at multiple points in time, which is quite rare in our field. And this is really important to do. We need to be doing much more of it because conditions change, society changes, people change. And so we need to see kind of how things are evolving over time as protected areas become more established and more well-known. And so hopefully this type of research can kind of continue over the, sort of every 10 years so we can kind of get a pulse on how things are going. They're certainly going in a good direction now in terms of support for these reserves. If you're the agency, you want the public to be supportive of what you're trying to do. But we need to make sure that that continues and doesn't change dramatically. All right, I will shut up. If you want more information, we've published a few of these technical reports that get into all the gory detail and numbers, far more than I went into today, and you can get that from my website. The most recent one, the one from the longitudinal stuff, for some reason, I just noticed this morning that that's not up on the website, so I'll be getting that added by our software and website guru in the next few days. And we've also published some studies out of these data, and you're welcome to go and look at those on the same website, but it ends in publications as opposed to reports. So I will shut up and be happy to entertain questions or comments or questionable comments or all of the above, that kind of thing. And yeah, thanks for your attention.
Okay, so we're going to switch to questions. Remember, if you have a question, raise your hand if you're in the room, and I'll bring you a mic. For those folks online, just put it in the chat, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth. So I'm going to start with those online. Any questions yet? Okay, so again, just put them in the chat, and we'll work through them. How about in the room?
Someone's got to put me on the spot.
I've got questions if they don't, so I see a hand.
Thanks for that, Mark. I was curious more about the assigned values question. I was curious how that question was worded because I could see it being maybe a very nitty-gritty question because I could see it being a little bit interpreted in different ways. And I'm also curious how you see those, if you know the relative importance of those values amongst these audiences. Because I think what I hear you saying is a coalescing of that these marine reserves offer value related to conservation and not related to other human benefits. But how does that relate to what these audience thinks is actually the most important things in life? Yeah,
so the exact question wording I can't remember. I wish I had brought the survey with me and then I could tell you, but it was along the lines of something like marine reserves offer a wide variety of are characterized by a wide variety of attributes. Thinking about Oregon's marine reserves, what attributes are most important to you? Something along those lines. So it's different, in terms of the values research, there's differences between sort of assigned values and cultural values and stuff like that. And so it was kind of along that line. And then there was sort of 23 of them, and they were on a scale from like not at all important to extremely important, something along those lines. But, and then people could, at the bottom, I think after that, they could sort of rate the top 3 or top 5 or something like that, and bottom 5. And I think that's where I pulled that stuff from. In terms of coalescing, yeah, there's kind of sort of the environmental and protectionist ones and then the human ones. And we've done some factor analysis on that to sort of see how they group out. And it doesn't group clearly into 2. It's a little more nuanced than that. And the people who live closest to those reserves, as well as the people sort of in the main population belt, rate those environmental ones a bit higher than those along the rest of the coast, whereas the more human-oriented ones are rated a little higher among the rest of the coast, but a little lower. So when we see that pattern through all of the results, typically. So does that kind of answer your question? Cool.
All right, I'm going to ask my question. For the place-based versus the rest of the coast, are there other demographics that might explain some of those differences other than just location?
Yeah, now you're testing my memory, because we looked at that 10 years ago when we looked at the differences sort of in terms of the communities of place folks versus the rest of the coast folks. The communities of place folks were a little bit older. From what I recall, we didn't measure income. They're a little bit more liberal. They're a little less likely to work in the fishing industry, or have family members who work in the fishing industry. Those were, but they surprisingly, they weren't huge differences. Like, there weren't like, okay, these are two totally different audiences. They weren't. Many of those demographics were not statistically different between the two, which kind of surprised us. But if we think of those people living closest to the reserves, when the reserves were going in, sort of pre-establishment and into the establishment phase, they were the ones targeted with a lot more information than others. And so, yeah, but there weren't huge differences.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Questions online? All right, my online team.
I've got a few of my grad students listening. They should be asking me difficult questions. This is their chance to ask me tough questions, because it's usually I'm asking them tough questions.
I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
In your knowledge of other types of work around the world, either on MPAs or on national and state parks, is this study that was done here in Oregon similar to things that have been done elsewhere, or does it kind of stick out as being unique in what it measured?
Well, the difficulty in answering that question is if we look at human dimension studies associated with marine reserves or protected areas or whatever you want to call them, the results vary dramatically around the world. And, which doesn't surprise us, because some of these reserves are created more top down. Like, if you think of Oregon, it was largely a top down effort. It was legislature kind of, and it was a global governmental push to create more marine reserves, and the legislature got on board. But other marine reserves around the world are very grassroots, where it's local communities coming together, wanting to protect access to marine resources, maybe for things like subsistence fishing and, cultural rights, that kind of stuff. And so we've got very different reasons for why these are set up around the world. We have very different management approaches around the world. Some it's an agency like here, whereas others it's a community working with a nonprofit like the Nature Conservancy that's running these things. And so we see results dramatically differ from one place. There isn't sort of a consistent theme. I mean, I could find 10 or more cases that show similar results to what I showed you, but I could also find 10 or more studies that show the complete opposite of that. And so it's really hard to generalize. In terms of here in the States, there's quite a bit of human dimensions work that was done in California with the establishment of those reserves. I'd argue it wasn't done very well. It was largely done by consultants and not by academics who knew more. Anyway, I won't get into that. Well, we see some similar results there. They haven't done as much time series as we have over time. They kind of did a lot when it was established, and then it fell off the cliff. They're still doing a few studies here and there, but they don't have the sort of longitudinal stuff.
Great. I have two other questions. Great.
We'll come back. Yeah.
All right, online, go ahead.
Given the general support for Oregon MPAs, does it seem there's support for increasing the size or number of Oregon reserves? Ours are fairly small, and the benefits could likely increase if they were larger, but there's also resistance from some vocal groups.
Yeah. That's a question I'd more turn over to Tommy to answer, but let me just say one thing quickly before Tommy chimes in. We have no idea, because we didn't ask about any questions associated with increasing number or increasing size. We don't have a single variable across 10 years on that. So I don't know. but have you guys done some
Yeah,
of
we
that
did.
stuff? Okay, good. So Tommy can answer, which gets me off the hot seat on that one.
We did a 2017 study with Craig Lindbergh, who's a colleague of Mark's in the College of Forestry. And it was a complicated study. I won't get into the design, but to answer that specific question, we asked people that were aware of the reserves, what was their spatial preference for the reserves? Would they prefer the reserves remain at the status quo, increase, or decrease? And these were all people who were aware of the reserves. And it was roughly a 50-50 split between increase and status quo among the supporters of the reserves specifically. So
You guys have any data on the people who hate the idea of reserves? I mean,
yeah, but I don't remember that chart,
yeah,
so
they're
I
gonna
can't
wanna-
answer that.
yeah.
The opposition, I think, was in the 20 to 30% range, and it was strongly correlated to occupational community of fishers, as well as households who somebody was working in the marine reserves. I'm sorry, in the fishing industry.
Yeah. Which just gets back to Simon's question, just similar to what we found. Yeah.
All right. Questions in the room? Okay, I'll get back to you, I promise.
Thank you so much. So just recently, the UN passed the High Seas Treaty. So I'm curious with what their goal is by 2030, how that will impact the current size of our reserves and how that maybe change your questionnaires, and if that, with this information now out in the public, if that's going to change opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's continued push for more protected areas of the ocean. And part of that is just because we have a huge imbalance of terrestrial protected areas versus marine. So, you know, around the world, we're around 16, 17, 18% terrestrial protected areas, but it depends on what you characterize as protected. And we're about half that of the ocean, which is actually closer now than it was a decade ago when we were, you know, 2, 3, 4% in the ocean and 12, 13-ish. So we're closing that gap a little bit. In terms of what it means for Oregon, in terms of more reserves or larger reserves, I don't have a clue. That's their role. But I don't even think that there hasn't been really much discussion around that, right? If we get the mic down here for Tommy, because I think he wants to add to that. But I mean, I haven't heard much on that at all. That's one reason why we didn't ask questions about it, because it was like not really on the drawing board right now as far as
Yeah. Theoretic. Oh, need to be up.
Yeah, I need to move.
Theoretically, right now, with the evaluation process related to the marine reserves, the legislature could increase, decrease, status quo, keep the same, or eliminate the marine reserves. There was no long-term mandate that they would exist in perpetuity. At present, the expectation is simply that we will remain with the status quo and perhaps some institutional changes related to how we manage the reserves and how we monitor the reserves. There are some people which would advocate for expansion. It's not by no means a majority of the population of Oregon.
Good question.
All right, we've
Thank
got
you,
a
Phil.
question online. Hang on just a second. I try to bounce back and forth.
Oh, yep.
Can you address the benefits of marine reserves in Oregon and around the world?
Yeah, how much time do we have? That's a huge question. In some cases, marine reserves have been hugely beneficial from a conservation perspective, in terms of increasing fish habitat, et cetera, et cetera. In other places, though, there's research that shows they haven't had a big effect. In fact, they've had a bigger socioeconomic effect than any kind of very marginal environmental effect. And so it's extremely case specific. And that's why so much research needs to go into the creation of these beforehand. And in Oregon, I mean, I know I was involved in discussions. I arrived at OSU in 2006, and I was involved in discussions pretty much as soon as I got here. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of research to try and understand before the legislature created these things. in Oregon in terms of benefits, well, I'd rather hand that over to you guys because I know you guys have got some direct measures on that, but yeah, it really varies dramatically.
So we were asking benefits of our Oregon reserves.
I know I'm putting you on the spot. Feel free to punt it back to me.
Okay, I can address the socioeconomic benefits. We looked at tourism and we looked at amongst the Oregon visitors, we have a long series of visitor intercept studies. And one of the things we have always asked, are you aware that you're at a marine, of the existence of the marine reserves? That number has consistently gone up. But when you ask, are you aware you are at a marine reserve, site-specific knowledge, that number hasn't increased substantially, which means locational knowledge, factual knowledge is lower. And then when we probe trip motives, did you come to visit a marine reserve? It's flatline. The answer is virtually no one is coming to the coast at present to visit. So the perceived benefits are the social benefits of feeling good that we're protecting the ocean and things like that, many of which are touched on in Mark's studies.
From an ecological perspective.
All right, and I'm just going to remind folks that Tommy is the Human Dimensions with ODF&W. I did not include that in his little intro, so giving you some context. So go ahead and introduce.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay. I'm the program manager for the Oregon Marine Reserves. And I think the question was, what are some of the benefits of marine reserves here in Oregon? And so I needed a minute to just take my time to think about what I was going to say. And I guess I would say a lot of the new knowledge that we're learning that's relevant to other nearshore management. So we're generating knowledge that's informing the stock assessment process from new data streams, that are looking at changes over time in the same place. And we've never been able to do that before here in Oregon. We're also gathering data on really deep subtidal sea star species and learning about their impacts from sea star wasting and some other species that haven't gotten quite the attention as maybe that ochre sea star you see in the intertidal area or the sunflower sea star that's kind of been talked about. Additionally, some of the socioeconomic research has been relevant, again, outside of just marine reserves, thinking about using our economic models to evaluate sea otter reintroduction or contributing knowledge and information about people's awareness related to other ocean topics like ocean acidification and hypoxia, those low oxygen zones on the coast. There have also been some benefits related to fishermen as well. It's provided an opportunity for dialogue with ODFW, especially in places like up on the North Coast and down on the South Coast, where ODFW presence and researchers aren't kind of quite as frequent, as say here on the Central Coast. There's been actually a fisherman's fund that has funded some research in the marine reserves. We've been able to have this dialogue about how to, improve research ideas, how to set up design of projects, how to better build gear to be able to, better study the ocean and how it's changing. So there are lots of different benefits. We could probably go on, but those are some of the ones to share.
Thanks for letting us put you on the spot. And Dave, it is your turn.
Hi, thank you for your talk. On your vote for or against slide, do you think there would be a significant change if there was a cost involved with the for vote?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some research that's done then. It's called stated choice analysis or trade-off analysis, where it's like, okay, if you vote this way, this is kind of what it means in terms of costs or impacts to certain things or benefits to certain things. And then you can kind of see how people's voting changes based on those trade-offs. And I've done some of that work in other research, but not on the marine reserve stuff. And so we don't have data on that. But yeah, that's one thing we can model for sure.
All right. Any other questions online? Okay, we're going to take one more question in the room and
Yeah.
we'll wrap it up.
All right.
So
Because there's cookies still outside, right? Well, I shouldn't have said that because all the people online will be sad now.
So if you only need one more survey
Yeah.
to get your billion.
Yep.
I'm betting that it wouldn't be a mail survey. And I think that you would probably have to very dramatically change your survey techniques depending on where that billion people were. If they were a billion people worldwide
Mhm.
or a billion people throughout the US. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. I mean, there's all sorts of different survey techniques, in-person, telephone, internet-based, mail. But you're right in terms of you got to know your audience before you design the sampling method. So if this was a study in Japan or in many Asian countries, asking them about how they feel about marine reserves there, many of them will not respond to surveys. And in particular, face-to-face surveys. And so you have to be kind of a little bit more creative in how you get information. And it might not be through surveys. It might be through focus groups or interviews and that kind of stuff. And so different cultures respond very differently to surveys. Here in the US, we're kind of used to surveys. We're moving toward more of a preponderance of online surveys, which has a whole litany of pros and cons associated with it, which I won't get into. I've written a book on the topic, but you know, for high response rates, it's always better to do it in person because it's much more difficult for a person to turn you down face to face. And so some of the work that Tommy's done has been in person up and down the coast, people like visiting these areas. But if you want to get out to a broader representative sample of the public, mail tends to be good, but it's also one of the most expensive and it takes some time because you have to go through multiple rounds of this. Most of the surveys that we see on the news are often done to panels, which are people paid to do surveys, as opposed to not paid like our work. And they're gathered very, very quickly. And then they do a lot of data weighting and a lot of manipulation of the data to then say it's representative of the public. And so, yeah, and there's pros and cons of everything. But we wanted to make sure that we were consistent across the 10-year period for sure. But we have done some online stuff as well that showed basically the same result as we've had. I tend to avoid doing phone surveys because response rates are atrocious. And it's very difficult to get representative samples with telephone surveys these days because there's so many people on do not call lists. So difficult getting cell phone access numbers. And so you tend to have a very elderly respondent base when you do phone surveys. So anyway, yeah. But you got to be careful. You got to understand your audience before you move forward. Yeah.
all right, I'm going to wrap us up. I'm just going to point out that Mark has his email address and contact information up on the
Yep.
screen. So if you have any additional questions for folks that are online, I think you can reach out there. For everybody in the room, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. How about one more round of applause for our speaker? And for our guest speakers that didn't know they were on stage, thank you very much to our two ODF and W speakers. And we will hopefully see you in 2 weeks. Remember, next week there's no seminar. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks. Strangle myself with this thing.
For folks online, we're going to end the presentation now. Thanks for being here.